Okay, think about this fascinating geographic mystery for a second. Australia is literally one of the largest countries on the planet. It sits right next door to the booming economies of Asia, it controls thousands upon thousands of miles of coastline, and it relies heavily on global trade to fuel its economy. Yet, despite having all of these massive advantages, the northern half of the country is incredibly empty. So, throughout our time together in this explainer, we're going to unpack the geography, the history, and the economics to figure out exactly why that is. It's honestly a staggering reality. Nearly 98% of Australians live in a tiny fraction of the country, avoiding the far northern coastline almost entirely. Most people imagine Australia as just endless deserts in the rugged outback. And sure, that's not exactly wrong, but the truth is that almost everyone is huddled together in these very specific coastal pockets down in the south and the east, leaving just a tiny sliver, roughly 2% of the population, to inhabit the vast, sweeping expanse of the top end. Which brings us to the central question we really need to solve today. Why hasn't the North birthed a massive metropolis? I mean, on paper, this coastline should be a bustling gateway. Yet, the biggest city in this entire northern region actually has fewer residents than a lot of American suburbs. We need to figure out what exactly stopped Australia's north from becoming the country's next great megacity, especially when it's sitting so close to some of the busiest shipping routes on Earth.
Let's kick things off with part one, the geographic paradox.
To really peel back the layers of this paradox, we have to talk about scale. Because Australia is absolutely a land of extremes. Despite being the sixth largest country on Earth by landmass, it has a surprisingly sparse total population of only around 28 million people. Just think about that. You have this incredibly massive continental landmass, yet the number of people actually inhabiting it is remarkably small compared to its global footprint. And to put that crazy scale into perspective, the entire continent of Australia actually has fewer residents than the US state of Texas alone. When you wrap your head around that mind-blowing fact, it becomes super clear just how dramatically concentrated the Australian population is. Nearly everyone is clustered in southern cities, like Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, and Perth. But as soon as you start moving north, that temperate weather and dense urban living just completely vanishes. Which brings us to part two, the map illusion. If you just pop over a world map, Northern Australia looks like it has a massive, undeniable advantage. Take the city of Darwin, for example. It's actually geographically closer to the booming Asian hubs of Jakarta and Singapore than it is to Australia's own capital city, Canberra. From a purely economic standpoint, having a coastline facing directly toward the fastest-growing economic region on Earth seems like an absolute guaranteed recipe for massive ports and booming megacities. But here's the major catch. A map is essentially a liar by omission. A coastline facing the world's most dynamic economies absolutely doesn't guarantee a booming port if the land itself actively resists human settlement. Maps are great at showing us distance, sure, but they absolutely do not tell you how difficult a place is to actually live in. And as we're about to see, Northern Australia is far, far more challenging than a two-dimensional map could ever convey. That takes us right into part three, nature's pushback. Unlike the familiar four seasons you'd find in the South, or most of the US for that matter, the North is locked in this brutal, binary survival cycle. It sits directly within the tropics. First, you get the wet season, where these massive monsoon systems dump enormous amounts of rain, literally swallowing roads, overflowing riverbanks, and cutting off entire communities. Then the pendulum swings wildly to the dry season. Water sources shrink up fast, temperatures absolutely soar, and the risk of devastating wildfires skyrockets. This is definitely not a climate that easily accommodates millions of people, or, anyone who just enjoys a mild, relaxing afternoon. And the headache goes way beyond just the weather. Because building a city requires reliable transportation, stable water grids, and predictable logistics. But up north, achieving that is an unbelievably expensive battle. You are literally fighting against ancient, heavily weathered soils that offer terrible agricultural potential. You have to engineer your way around rugged floodplains, dense mangrove forests, and the constant looming threat of massive tropical cyclones that can wipe out your infrastructure overnight. Oh, and we can't forget the wildlife, which just adds a whole other layer of intensity to the survival challenge. While it's super fascinating for tourists, sharing your local coastline with massive saltwater crocodiles patrolling the rivers or deadly box jellyfish hanging out in the coastal waters makes large-scale settlement incredibly difficult. Even the flora is hostile. There are native plants there with microscopic stinging hairs that can inflict agonizing pain. It really drives home the point that living in the north isn't just a backyard experience.
It's much more of a daily survival challenge. Moving on to part 4, the weight of history.
You see, when British settlers showed up in the late 18th century, they understandably weren't looking to conquer the absolute harshest, hottest parts of the continent. They were looking for reliable natural harbors, fertile farmland, and climates that actually felt familiar to them. The Southeast offered exactly that in places like Sydney and Melbourne. And once those initial settlements took root, it triggered this unstoppable snowball effect. Migrants brought investment, investment built infrastructure, and over decades, that growth just continuously created more growth, turning those southern settlements into the massive economic magnets they are today. And finally, part 5, the economics of isolation. A lot of folks look at the map and assume Darwin should naturally be Australia's version of Singapore, right? A bustling, incredibly wealthy commercial gateway. But there is one massive missing ingredient here: people. Singapore sits at a strategic choke point, serving hundreds of millions of people right in its immediate vicinity. Darwin just simply lacks that massive surrounding population base. So instead of a global commercial gateway, it operates primarily as a highly important strategic military hub, even hosting rotating U.S. Marines. But a military base doesn't equal a megacity, and today Darwin sits at only about 140,000 residents. So this creates an incredibly brutal economic trap. The North suffers from these vast distances, which means building basic infrastructure like roads, railways, hospitals requires an enormous financial investment. But here is the catch. Investors logically hesitate to spend billions of dollars in a place where there isn't an existing population of customers. And because there's a lack of investment, population growth just remains perpetually slow. It's this vicious, self-reinforcing cycle of remote economics that is incredibly difficult to break out of. The really harsh reality is that the North is constantly competing against a head start that has existed for more than 2 centuries. Think about it. It isn't just fighting an uphill battle against its extreme tropical climate and sheer geographic isolation. It's actively competing against the established workforces, massive universities, sophisticated financial institutions, and entrenched industries of those booming southern cities. When you stack these two realities side by side, it's night and day. On one side, the booming southern cities offer temperate climates, millions upon millions of residents, massive infrastructure, and enormous economic momentum. On the other side, the northern coastline presents extreme tropical weather, sparse populations of maybe 140,000 in major hubs, staggering logistical costs, and intense isolation. It becomes completely obvious why booming populations stay securely anchored down south, leaving the north practically empty despite its incredible geographic proximity to Asia. Which leaves us with one final, incredibly provocative question to wrap up this explainer. We've seen that just because a location looks amazingly valuable on a map, it doesn't automatically mean it can support a thriving megacity. The natural resources and proximity to Asia mean the North's geopolitical value is absolutely going to continue to rise. And hey, maybe new technologies will one day tame that harsh environment. But it forces us to ask, as human innovation marches forward, can we ever truly overrule geography? Or will the land itself always have the final say? It's definitely something to think about. Thanks for joining me, and keep questioning the map.